Hello everyone, today we talk about from 1150 to 1300 AD European warfare, right? So a period that goes already beyond what is typically also thought as the feudal age, in a sense, and quoting a reflection from the famous French historian Philippe Contamine. He's very old. He wrote a lot about medieval warfare. As you know, he's a great name. This thing is at the beginning of the third chapter of his famous book, La Guerre au Moyen Âge, so the war in the Middle Ages. That is a must for. It's outdated at this point, yes, because historiography has gone forward in the last decades. But if you have never read it, I advise it to you, not just for historians or not even people who are particularly passionate about medieval warfare, because it makes you really understand a lot of things. As you will see, I do not agree with everything that's written here, but it's definitely a very good starting point to have a discussion about certain things, and it's very useful, especially because it's very well documented. I mean, he quotes a lot of stuff, right? The guy knows a freaking lot of sources, and he spent a lifetime on them. So it's very thick, dense of information, and that's what you really want. Especially, it's very useful to start. We could talk about this book, complexively, like the method that he has used, what it was telling us, what's the purpose, etc. Maybe in another video. I actually made several videos already, basing myself on certain paragraphs, because it's very useful to just start and go there with the thinking. And I was reading this the other day to make this video, and actually I thought it as an introduction to essentially second half of the 12th, as we've seen in 13th century Western European warfare. And I'm sorry we always talk mostly about Western European warfare, but in the other videos, more specifically dedicated to typologies of troops, armies, organizations, etc., I hope we'll shift ever more towards the east, right? In other areas we already covered with other videos, but as you know, that's where essentially most of the wealth and population and was concentrated, and therefore where most things went on, and especially where things were better documented, and this is really important. And this paragraph here is just essentially a realization of the existence of certain periods of stasis of peace, if you want, which it's a bit of a far-fetched notion at this point. We will try to explain why, but fundamentally concentrating on the fact that in spite, yes, the 12th or the 13th century, so the increase of warfare, right, and the increasing of the devastations, of the destructing capabilities of these armies, for the obvious reason that the powers were getting more centralized, so they were simply more capable of delivering hell, right? And it's never been done before, since centuries at least, centuries and centuries in Europe. There were still important areas of the continent that were spared from warfare, or at least that had what Luttwak would call like low intensity warfare, was something like that, which is another term that I honestly don't like, but that renders the idea, at least as far as the destructing the destructions, the intensity of them could be like, because it's obvious that there was always, these were highly militarized societies. Right, at some point we'll make a video describing the fact that, an average 14th century European province had a much higher involvement from side of the population to warfare than 18th century Prussia, right? So in terms of, the same term militarization is a bit vague in itself, because there are important differences indeed, but the concept is that there was definitely a participation to warfare on a regular base from the side of more people on average in this moment than it would be in the future, because gradually central powers tend to disarm, as it had already been going on from a while, and that's in part what we will be talking about today. But naturally, because society had gradually articulated itself, stratified to the point that with increase of professionalism, just fewer people went to war, while the others fundamentally worked for it to happen from an economical point of view. But what struck me in here, and it's actually one of the most beautiful paragraphs that I read from the book, because it's very intelligent, is even though it doesn't bring it to the next step that I will try to make today, very unworthily considering the name of the scholar, but definitely, I've had at this point my share of interest, especially towards the later period we will be analyzing now. And I believe that there is an important comparison can be drawn, right? A dynamic can be drawn with all cautions, as we will see now, between essentially these three important parts of Europe. There are France, Italy, and Germany, right? That we will come to discuss also more intensively in the next, in the future, because I tell you, I'm abandoning the basic manuals at this point. We're going to something deeper, because I think we have discussed enough about certain things in general, and we can go a bit more deeply and specifically at a local level, not just at a comprehensive one. But still, these macro comparisons, in my opinion, are very important, because in spite of the homogeneity that existed in medieval warfare, we gotta give that naturally these societies, these countries, these peoples were different, right? They, from a political and social point of view, there are very different dynamics that are reflected sometimes, at every level. Just think about the difference in knighthood that occurred across Europe, right? Think about the German ministeriales, or the Italian milites pro commune, or the caballeros villanos in Spain, or the development of French cavalry. Every country had a bit of a different dynamic that is interesting to analyze, because it's a product of certain things that had been going on from a while now, and that are very important. That we'll try to explain in this video, essentially to understand also the level of belligerency of these countries. That is to say, and this is the link that I draw with Contamini. What Contamini is saying here is how the exposure, or better, the carrying out of warfare, right, the waging of warfare in specific countries actually brought to specific military developments, and more specifically the fact of increasing the military quality of the armies. It's something that as we'll see now, is very complex, because we have to take into consideration really many factors. But the thesis and drawing here is that certain countries actually had imposing military development with different outcomes, right, because of the protracted warfare, right, and instead others that had been even more, had been more at peace and had been even more prosperous in that regard, had however lowered also the level of their of belligerency, of combativity, we could say, always given that this has nothing specifically to do with and that's the point of the video, with a pre-existing, let's say, of a standard reality, right? But something that was built over time, and that sometimes even a short range of time influenced the level of quality of their armies, that naturally were also quite different, just for, as we've seen, political and social reasons. So what Contamini is saying here is that, and we know what the picture is here because we have talked about it extensively, is that fundamentally in this period between 1150 and 1300, the dates are approximate, Europe knew at different intervals and on very wide geographical areas periods of almost complete peace, right, with the favor of which the demographic and economical development especially couldn't but increase. This is a very important structural realization. I mean, as we often said, these are very delicate political and social systems. They do not have the rate of growth we have today. War can really mess up things for generations to come. That's why even relatively small battles, think about Bouvines. Bouvines wasn't this great. We made a video about the Battle of Bouvines this summer, and it's not a greater battle than others were fought across Europe and that nobody actually gives a damn about, but it's undoubtedly the most important battle in the Middle Ages as far as, the various political consequences of it were, right? The idea that a few thousand knights can't, clash in a place where there's literally nothing, nor at the time, nor today, right, between the border between France and Belgium, in this town of Bouvines, could make the history of literally the wall, France, England, Holy Roman Empire, Sicily, and as you understand, all of Europe at that point. Well, that is exactly because of the imposing expense, the imposing cost on these societies that even an army of those dimensions, and we're talking, by the way, of kingdoms like the one of France, the one of England, right? The Germans, yes, intervened, but there were few, with Otto of Brunswick after all. So we're talking about the two major, the most structured European monarchies at the time, with maybe the exception of Sicily. It's a few, right, still, but the outcome of that battle decides fundamentally an enormous chunk of European history for centuries to come, right? And therefore, and you can imagine how this all was. I mean, war includes, it's not just the battle, but the ravaging of the countryside, the destruction of the cultivations, the slaughtering, the rape of the peasantry, of the labor force, right? The peasantry that had paid also for all of this to happen. That is, it's just through the work of the fields, the harvest, and so on, that, those French, German, English knights could fight there. And that costed a freaking lot, right? For one single knight fighting with barding for the horse with full armor at a time. There were hundreds and hundreds of people breaking their backs in the fields for a very long period of time, right? And we can say at this point especially that we're talking mainly about the 13th century, which is literally the apex of feudal warfare. It's as if whole society, with some exception, let's think about the city-states that were emerging at the same time in parallel, but it's the same thing for them too, was fundamentally polarized towards the vertex, towards this top that on the battlefield was embodied literally by the knightly class, the military elite. So areas that are spared from major campaigns, right, of hundreds of thousands of knights crossing the countryside, ravaging, and mostly living off the land, right? It's not at this point there is a dramatically developed logistical system that can support, right? So that's how literally the thing went. You go campaigning in one place, and you literally live off the land. That means you race to the ground most of what you find in front of you, destroying all the socio-economical fabric in the process. Has a dramatic structural impact on the future of that country, right? Because it's not that, when that army has passed, the people, the remnants, come back to do what they do. The infrastructures are destroyed, the tools the wealth is exhausted. They don't have the means to restart that. So these people start even emigrating to other provinces. The land goes depopulated. There are important shifts in that sense of the balance of wealth, right? And some of the most ravaging campaigns, I think about the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, even are able to wipe out and even entire maybe not so much as the entire culture or civilization in those places, but definitely, that center of power that the Count of Toulouse had been, it would never be the same afterwards, right? And that was something that also had been built over the centuries, by the way, with, again, the struggle, the fatigue, the hard work, the sweat and tears of thousands and thousands and thousands of people over the generation, right? Accumulating wealth, right? Here, the wealth is not so volatile. Yes, during the 13th century, economy gets more monetized, but that's exactly because there is more that reflects real economy too. That there is more resources around. Trade balance has shifted from the Muslim to the Christian world. There is a dramatic development, a rate of growth. We have described many times in Europe that had never been seen before, and technically I think it's an exception in the history. Can say maybe the entire history of mankind, but certain rhythms of growth are really dramatic. At least the West has rarely met any other time of growth, given the same basis, the same potential, right? I'm sure that not even during the age of exploration was such a high rate of growth compared to the availability of resources at a local level, and this was not seizing wealth from other countries around the world. This was, literally working within the same Europe with local resources. So that gives you also a dimension of why wars actually increased, but in a way were necessarily more controlled, right? More channeled, and sometimes very devastatingly, as we've seen, towards specific areas, while others were spared, right? Others were often the same ones that paid for that war, in a way or another, and were involved, were actively making that war in order to expand in that sense. So it's not just peace, but specifically it's also investment in war, because war is a business, and it's actually a pretty good one at many levels, and also not much of an option for those, especially in those times. So you understand that regions that know a prolonged time of peace and this time can really accumulate a lot of wealth. This was the case, in fact, and starting from this point is very important, the case of many French regions, right, that were just scratched during throughout several decades just by episodic and superficial military expeditions and private wars, right? That could be something ferocious. Not even for a moment underestimate the radical violence that this all, and the radical evil. I mean, you read Chronicles, you read something you will really do not want to read about what innocents also underwent, and this is the reality of the world at the time. These were pretty damn dark and abusive societies. It was something unspeakable, but at the same time, in spite of this, of course, numerous smaller raids and private questions, etc., the effects of these wars were ever more circumscribed, either by the royal or princely authorities. France, as you know, here we're speaking specifically of northern France more than else, because that's the real historical France, right? The south is technically not. It's just a product of modern nation state. But those are, as you know, this dramatically fertile Atlantic plains and very extensive lands of great wealth, right, of agricultural resources that basically no other country knows in Europe, still today, by the way, at least in Western Europe. And the point here is that the Capetian monarchy from the Ile-de-France, especially from starting from the mid-12th and especially to the beginning of the 13th century, starts really creating the kingdom France is known for, right? The kingdom had always been there, but the power of French kings had not been a big deal up to that time. After Bouvines, France rockets to the stars. It becomes by far the single most greatest power out there, while before technically the English and with their French possessions even had way more, but comparably in terms of just territories and people, well, than the French kings themselves, and that's why also the campaigns of Philip Augustus are so important. We'll talk about that for a while at the end of this. But also, France is famously, and will always remain, we could say up to Louis XIV, the land of princes. Right? There are high noblemen that are fundamentally as powerful as the king. They have interest actually to. I mean, sometimes they are in competition with the king. Sometimes, however, they recognize that there is an opportunity, after all, deriving from being legitimized by the central power and participating in fact, to the various expeditions were legitimized as such. Think about, in fact, the Albigensian Crusade was a very clever way of getting rid of the nobility in northern France by Philip Augustus, and who instead used essentially mercenaries against the English. But the same crusades, think about when Louis IX creates the port of Aigues-Mortes. I don't know if you ever visited it. It's beautiful. In the Mediterranean. This is the first properly French port there, because up to that point the French kings had never had an access to the Mediterranean. And that's where Louis launches the Crusades, first in Egypt, then in the aborted one, at least, that reached up to Tunisia, where he died, and so on. And in here, the idea, for example, this was realized also by the nobility, that, as we'll be more evident, for example, I don't know, from the time of Edward III with the chevauchée in France itself, that raiding a foreign country is a hell of a good thing after all, because you can make a lot of money through the raiding, through the booty, the loot. You can even create basically a kind of a military class that, however, bends his ambitions and destructive capabilities in a foreign land, so not at home, right? Well, home becomes rich because of what these men bring back home, and it makes the country fatter. So it's as brutal as it sounds, and that's exactly how, even things like monarchies and states eventually emerged, in a sense. And naturally, at home, these princes, the king, as landlords, care for their territories, their properties, to be at peace and to grow. Right. This implies in part also the militarization of the population, and here it's not a directly proportional thing, but tendentially it happens also a bit like that. The hope is that what you can get from the demilitarization of the country is to be invested in the construction of a more elaborated, articulated, and developed military system that could be used as such as before. But nobody, for example, achieves what the English would achieve during the 100 Years' War in that regard. And this has also to do with the progressed unity and compactness of the Kingdom of England. We made videos about this compared, say, to the one of France. It might have been very powerful, but it was, in a sense, more private in nature, in the nature of power. Right, and that is something that the French had since a long time. Right, the Normans started instead in England something very different. But again, let's not digress into too many aspects of this. But the idea is that let's take the example of Bretagne, right? That in half of a century, so basically in the second half of the 13th, knew only one prolonged warfare, the one of Jean Leroux and Olivier de Clisson between 1254 and 1261, which is actually not a short war, right? But still, it had nothing exceptional in terms of intensity. Also, Bretagne was, it was not dramatically developed compared to other, the great Seine or Loire valleys, right? That's essentially where most of the wealth was concentrated. Do not underestimate that too. But at the same time, think that, aside from this war, it's objectively in 50 years, a few, right? It's not that they were happy to have, that war as well, but, it's objectively a few. In the 55 years of reign of Henry III of England, 1216, 1272, just has a hell of a long time, only 20 were the years of war. It's not a few, even in here, and that's where I also have some problem with Contamine actually stating this, in the sense that, yeah, I mean, you can't really say that 20 years of war in 55 years, it's a big deal. But at the same time, he explains that the thing was a bit more diluted. It's not that Britain is particularly big extensionally, but if you count the years of war here, he lists 1225, 1230, 1242 to 1243, 1253 to 1254, and 5 years in Wales, 1223, 1220, 1228, 1231, 1245, 1253, 2 on the Scottish frontier in 1244 and 1255, while England proper was the theater of war only for 6 years, from 1216, 1217, 1224, 1233, and from 1264 to 1265. Then he speaks of Italy. He says that the rivalries between the Italian lords and communes, in spite of their relative frequency, influenced only limitedly the life and daily activities. On this, I actually disagree, in the sense that, just as for Britain, you can't say yet that these wars were relatively contained, but objectively, if you look at what these powers were up to all the time, it was mostly about war, right? Indirectly or indirectly, even when it didn't happen, right? The world communities were called for it. There was a great expanse attached to this. The whole society, in a sense, gravitated around warfare. And if you speak of the same period in Italian warfare, you actually see a hell of things going on, and actually pretty damn large armies involved. And yeah, clashing and beating each other pretty hard, and consuming important resources that, however, even these communities had, because even Italy at that point was rocketing to the stars, economically speaking. Then Contamine speaks of the fact that, and this is objectively true, that compared to the previous times, the sovereigns specifically were not committed in Europe those military operations with yearly frequency that were characteristic of the High Middle Ages. This is true, definitely, and that emerges also as a feature of the monarchies throughout history, and at the point of the creation. This is the moment the properly national monarchies are founded, and where things get, in fact, a bit more, articulated. I mean, these powers are bigger, so they have also greater deterrence. That's why warfare doesn't happen so, because it's not about raiding just your neighboring county that, was just like a sport, a game, right? It was not much different from hunting, right? That is something that even, I don't know, someone like Louis VI back in the day, even French kings could do. Like they wouldn't differ just from other knights, as even in terms of lifestyle. Naturally, at this point, kings were knights, and it couldn't be otherwise, right? But at the same time, their figure was rising, right? It was a bit more detached, but a bit more erratic. An important political theory and symbology developing around the monarchy in this sense. And it's obvious that, as Contamine does, mostly you speak of these advanced eras in Europe. You speak of the great monarchies of France and England. You speak of the Italian city-states. You have definitely, yes, the idea of exactly of those regions where this separation was more evident. But in other areas of Europe, like in Central Europe, or even in the North, in the East, and so on, there was a plethora of, even the highest authorities sometimes were still, they had a smaller military capacity altogether. I mean, think about Rudolf of Habsburg when he met with Philip IV of France, right? That he was called as the little Count of Habsburg, right? And then eventually after Markfeld, he won a big deal, became one of the most powerful princes in Europe, surely the greatest in the Holy Roman Empire at that point. But in comparison to France, it's just like a midget in front of a giant, right? So it's obvious that even in terms of lifestyle and local policies and so on, even the direct involvement of a king is a big deal, right? It's to make you understand the extremes. It's like when in the Renaissance there was all a monarchic politologists stressed how the sovereign was the head of the country and that therefore couldn't risk too much, and therefore it's like today's presidents, heads of states are, hyper guarded and secure, because if you take them out, you cause an enormous damage to the whole system that you really want to prevent, right? It's not because you like necessarily the guy, but it's the figure, it's the institution, right? It's not surprising that the mystics of monarchies developed historically in England, in France, right? The idea of the immortal hypothesis of the king, for which le roi est mort, vive le roi, because there is no moment in which the monarchy dies. The man can die, but the monarchy and him lives on as the figure that the king is, right? There is a beautiful book about this that is the King's Two Bodies. The King's Two Bodies, yes, by Kantorowicz. It's a beautiful read. It's actually a collection of essays, but it talks a lot about, especially about England and France, because the thing actually was born in England even before than France, right? It was actually exported there by the 15th century and developed further. Even though the French monarchy had already, greater mystics of itself, but as far as the individual figure of the king was concerned, it was mostly in England. And it's not a coincidence, because that reflects the actual unity of the English kingdom as it was created, and it was by legacy, and that's something that lives in a way still today, right? So about the direct involvement of monarchs, think about Philip Augustus, Philip II in France after Bouvines. Before, he had been fighting a lot. He fought in the same battle. After that, he didn't fight much, right? France had radically changed at that point. Even think of Louis IX, Saint Louis, that for the majority of his reign, his body was a knight, in fact, and he launched some of the most important military expeditions of the century. He didn't have to mobilize his armies at such close time in distance, right? They didn't know, these kings didn't know anymore at regular intervals the fatigue and the dangers of the campaigns. It's something that started happening una tantum, right? So, in other words, their direct involvement, more than else, with war had become much less strict. And this definitely Contamine is right. Not only, this is important. It's important to stress what the before was. Like literally before the kings, since the time you start reading Frankish chronicles, since the times of Charles Martel, were literally the basis of what eventually what we call sometimes improperly as feudalism would become, fundamentally entailed that the Frankish army, that at the end of the day is most of what also the Western Frankish kingdom has remained at this point, is making war every single damn year, and even multiple times in it, right? These men, these knights, live literally on horseback. They spend their entire time at war, except naturally the bad season, but their life revolves around it, and the whole political institutional balance revolves around that, right? And these people live for war. There is no other horizon in the mindset of these people. They know only that, and they can do only that, right? Because it's not that they can't read or write, or they have a centralized justice system, they have a notion of public culture in front. No, the only possible thing is war. And that's in fact where they excel, because historically speaking, that's France that generates this for reasons that have deeply to do with whatever Carolingian and Merovingian Gaul had been about, even since late Roman times, actually. And this thing gets to an end in these countries because of the concentration of power now that allows to essentially just freeze most wars, prevent most wars breakout. Just say, okay, if you dare do that, we will come there and you'll see what happens. Where deterrence works in this pacifying sense, and this is also how the path of civilization progresses in a sense, because it's exactly not through, a less impositive mean that you achieve peace and prosperity. On the contrary, right? We've never been so powerful in the history of mankind, and also we've never been so wealthy. So what does this mean? It means, as always, that the progress of civilization has literally nothing to do with the alleged decrease of the use of the capacity of military force, right? And it's important because it's not that these people do not understand war anymore, but they have grown up, right? They're heads of, we could say, state in the non-modernistic sense of the word. They're not just individual warriors. Even though, as you know, in the world culture here was permeated with that idea. These were warriors, right? They were fighters, at least, let's say, and then they learned to be something else. Dramatically skilled politicians, first and foremost, because, as we know very well, war is just a continuation of politics by other means, and it was already before, right? But it's that before they simply had less means. They had nothing but literally fighting all the day to get something done. And it was always an iron logic behind that. Never think that before these times there was the anarchy, the chaos, right? There was naturally a much more unstable reality, but the reason why it was unstable was actually very logical, very rational, which is something that we're not so eager to recognize sometimes. Because even back in the migration era, a chieftain, a king, was not just a hot-handed, everyday warrior. It was something way more than that, and wisdom and capacity and political intelligence were required to fight since a very early age. It goes back to tribal warfare, to any other, to every human society at the end of the day. So never stigmatize a system because it sucked. No, for its own context, that was the thing that it needed to be done. It's just that the resources do not allow you to do more than much. And under this point of view, in fact, we have Contamine here stresses rightfully that chivalry and properly knighthood in Western Europe hadn't lost, in the meanwhile, its dynamism. As we were saying before, 13th century is the apex of feudal warfare, proper, of chivalric warfare, literally of the capacities of heavy cavalry, under any point of view, zootechnic, technological, etc. Then eventually the standards would remain the same, but other things would start growing in the meanwhile. That is, infantries, especially from the century afterward, from the beginning of 14th century. But still, here, the peak of professionalism, of development of the medieval knight has been achieved, right? And these men were literally, like in all feudal societies, the single most intense combat machines you can ever conceive, right? These men were trained for a lifetime of war to fight in every single damn context imaginable, with any kind of weapon, every single kind of weapon, everyone. Bows, crossbows, yes, they were forbidden. They were obscured by the chivalric ideas. They were used all the time, right? Of course, they would preferably at this point be trained to fight collectively in the most brutally effective tactic of the time, of the shock charges of this thickly packed formations of heavily armored knights. That is the single most effective thing, but it's there wasn't only that, right? That what you would preferably use in a pitched battle, but for the rest, warfare was mostly about besieging stinky castles, raiding, destroying, slaughtering, all that stuff, and that is something you can imagine all the various situations, the variety of the situations in which this man could find himself all, right? And the dream, of course, was to die in a freaking pitched battle. Not of gangrene in some stinky hut where they had brought you after you had been wounded by a stupid, peasant with a bow, right? If that was, that was not much of an eventuality if you wore armor, but look at Richard Lionheart. Now, there were lots of knights, right? The 13th century is the apex also of the demographic power of medieval civilization. After Black Death, everything is like, in perspective, all pre-modern. There are all different cycles. In the 13th century, we still do not know much about this reality, but we know it was huge, demographically and economically. Consequently, also lots of people were involved in warfare, and there was plenty of knights who were anxious to just, beat each other and to massacre, and to earn their due in the process, whether it be in Europe or Outre-mer, or wherever. In the Iberian Peninsula was the Muslim shrinking, the retreat was accentuated after the famous battle, the famous Muslim defeat of the Las Navas in Tolosa in 1212, that opened fundamentally to Castile and her allies the enormous riches of southern Spain, and that is the most radical, let's say, territorial achievement. Like it's not much of a coincidence that 2 years after the French would do the same, basically, against the English. That there's the compaction of important domains in the process. That the Christians take Cordoba in 1236 and Seville in 1248. These were major cities. They were the heart of what the Islamic power in the Iberian Peninsula had been from half of a millennium, right? So that is a good. We talked often about the Reconquista as a pretty good example of how the Iberian Peninsula. I always like to treat it as a thing on its own, because it actually has an enormous importance, right? I speak mostly today. We will get to the point of France, Italy, and Germany. As the broader the legacy of the Carolingians, right? From a political, military point of view, but naturally, Spain had procured times at a certain level. It must be studied very carefully because it has excruciatingly fascinating things to tell. Hope we'll do it soon. So at the same time, around the 30s of the 13th century, the frontiers of Portugal reached basically today's limit, right? The size, and the Islamic presence in the Iberian Peninsula had shrunk fundamentally, a sort of bridgehead around Malaga, Granada, and Almeria, right? It would remain actually for a long time in Muslim possession, also because the Christian powers in the Iberian Peninsula start fighting on their own. In the Outre-mer states of the Near East, things were going differently, because the Christians were attaining just ephemeral successes. Yet the Crusaders went on, right? These Crusades proper went on. There were many important expeditions. Some were aborted. St. Louis, one of the last one, when he died, was an enormous thing. Quite likely Egypt would have been wiped out, and Jerusalem would have been reconquered. Edward I of England had gathered an enormous army only on its own. There was plenty of it. The Christian army counted in the tens of thousands, right? Hadn't it failed, right? The history of the world might have been very, very different. And I will not digress in how I actually believe the Crusades had a huge potential, right? The Westerners have developed historiographically this sense of defeatism. Yes, the Crusades were not, the Westerns didn't gain anything for that. It was, they were not worth it. They should have not done it. Yes, the usual story of who is defeated and has to whine about the thing. The truth is that those people knew pretty damned well what they were doing, and the Crusades were actually an extremely intelligent thing to do. There were enormous interest assets involved, and the fact they failed is actually a much more, it's not a deterministic thing, and ultimate powers had much greater potential. This is often realized, and the fact that the failure comes is it's something normal, right? Every power at this time in the world is extremely precarious. And the fact that Crusades happened and succeeded, especially at the beginning in the first place, is something that should deserve a much greater consideration about the actual capacities of the Frankish world at this point. We see still, think about the Third Crusade, a step backwards, still at the end of the 12th century, between 1191, right? So the participation of the three greatest sovereigns of the West, that were Philip II Augustus of France, Richard Leonard, Richard I of England, and Frederick I Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor. The Fourth Crusade, 1202-1203-4, brought famously to the creation of the Latin Empire of the East, so-called, or Romania. We made a video about its military organization just a few weeks ago. And the existence of this power, ever more precarious, however, was protracted itself for even more than 2 generations, between 1204 to 1261. So this shows how much commitment there was, how much interest there was actually towards these expeditions that were sometimes accidental. Like the Fourth Crusade was just a crusade like like all the others. It's a myth, the fact that it was directed at Constantinople. It all happened in the meanwhile, and also because of the Byzantines' fault, actually, that called the Crusaders in Constantinople for their dynastic matters. But let's say that here we're assisting not at a withdrawal. On the contrary, we're seeing the 13th century as the major expansion of the Western Frankish system. The same Roman Empire had been brutally westernized in culture. Look at the empire of Manuel I Comnenus. Look at the enormous amount of Western knights that went literally to fight for the Romans, who were settled as acritae, as even during the time of the Latin Empire, the Palaiologoi in Asia Minor used plenty of French, German knights. The Latins were everywhere, and the following crusades, combining the military action with diplomatic initiative, albeit not managing to prevent the containment and eventually the shrinking and eventually the disappearance of the Latin states in the east with the fall of Acre, famously in 1291, the last Frankish possession on the Asian continent, demonstrated that a part of the military aristocracy, when it was solicited and framed by the national monarchies, had not renounced to fight for the holy places. That is, the Crusades were remunerative and were seen as such. People wanted to fight in them, and there was a major interest from the side of the same sovereigns that invested huge amount of money. So that is if it wasn't also for the broader political military analysis of the thing, it was just for the wealth invested in such expeditions. You should be very carefully of deeming this as, ill-fated enterprises, because those were probably some of the best ones you could think. The same goes actually for, instead, one of the most successful one, that are the so-called Baltic Crusades. So in Prussia, think about the German expansion by initiative of the Teutonic Knights that had assumed the forms of holy war, just like just like in Jerusalem, there are beautiful passages that were exhorting. That, like, what is fascinating here is that the Westerners didn't differentiate between Muslim Spain, the Baltic countries, and the Near East, and the holy places in the Near East. We do today, because it sounds very, wargamistic, because we like the different settings, the differences. But in the medieval mindset, this was a unitary thing. There was just one Christianity. There was just, in this sense, one possible world and outcome, right? So in these three scenarios, there is actually an enormous, actually, as we've seen in the previous centuries, during the 11th, before the 90s, when the so-called First Crusade, happened. But during the 11th, during the 10th century, there had been plenty of literally expeditions that were launched by the papacy, famously in Spain, in southern Italy, that were basically just, they were promising heaven for just that they had built eventually what we sometimes think it began in the 90s of the 11th century. That was just a point of arrival, something that had been going on, had been created, developed, thought since even such a long time before, right? Because this is something that Christianity interrogated itself since a very long time. We've seen it even with Saint Ambrose of Milan back in the day, in the 5th century. The creation properly of a Roman and Christian moral conscience that involved the idea of the acceptance of the use of violence for the sake of protection of Christian society, right? It's a completely different thing, but it is just for saying that this didn't come out of nowhere, right? This is a bit the narrative of the progressistic, positivistic, modernistic Western historiography of the mid 20th century that wanted to amaze itself of the fact that at a certain point Europeans began to expand out of the alleged Dark Ages, and finding mechanicistic or technologistic explanations for it, where actually there was plenty of resources Europe had been settling and accumulating and developing and elaborating in the previous centuries, right? The Middle Ages were no Dark Ages, but by no standard. Just maybe a couple of centuries at the beginning of the time, and exclusively because of a lack of documentary evidence at a certain point, but not because that there was such a thing like a Dark Age, even just remotely thought or perceived as such. It wasn't like that, right? And when you see something that blossoms in this regard, very often in historiography, it seems as if it started all of the sudden. Instead, the result of what had started already from the previous centuries, right? Now, we get finally to the point of this all, and observing a bit more closely certain countries, to realize, though, that this is not a period that finishes in itself. There's always an afterwards. Recently, I fortunately had the time, and the luck, also because I choose topics randomly, to discuss the early 14th century. Recently, we made a video about the Battle of Courtrai. We recently made a video on 14th century Scottish infantry. So we touch on certain certain topics that are deeply connected to if you want, the end of this period of expansion of medieval civilization that is fundamentally the crisis, the stagnation, but not the recession of European economy and demographics starting from the late 13th century, that paves the road eventually for the big crack of the mid-14th with the Black Death and everything, as we were saying before. And there is a very, as you know, I research about that time specifically, and from a military point of view, so everything is deeply connected. So I can't discuss it now. I promise I will expand on this topic in not many other videos, because at the end of the day, that's what it would be easier also for me to do. But the idea is that this enthusiasm for the 13th century And in here, national historiographers do make a difference, right? Now, I will not make specific names, but in practice, I mean, what every country saw its past in a different way for different reasons. So I think, especially as Europeans today, what we should do is to recover the unitary ideal of this picture. The fact that all these countries were deeply intertwined among each other, and that therefore we cannot read just in a localistic sense the military developments of Europe. So the idea is, roughly as a prejudice, 13th century wealth, prosperity, happiness, whatever. I'm making it naturally overly bright to make it the contrast more sharp. But in the 14th century, contraction, crisis, bad stuff, collapse, The point, though, is that we have overlooked how throughout all the first half of the 14th century, the military systems had been developed during the 13th that definitely saw a dramatic boost of military, not just probably military development, but as we'll see now, probably military activity. And the two things are deeply connected, in my opinion. That's why I was struck actually by what we will be reading now in perspective, relatively to a broader vision. I mean, it's not that it was a surprise, but is that we have underestimated what certain military systems have accomplished also, and how much it took for them to enter in concrete crisis throughout most of the 14th century. Right, throughout actually the first half of the 14th century, and how even in there, yes, you can see a contraction. You can see what I define as a sort of refeudalization of European warfare, because yes, the Black Death was pretty traumatic in demographic terms. The poorer classes were the most hit. Literally, a lot of people died, but also they impoverished dramatically. So those, for example, those important infantries that had developed during the 13th century that won their sometimes their freedom at the beginning of the 14th eventually contracted. So there was a sort of coming back in relative terms of cavalry that starts to be mitigated just from the last decades of the 14th century with the gradual introduction of firearms, hand firearms among the infantry, and that until the mid-15th century will never quite regain an upper hand, and that at that time for good, over cavalry. Speaking especially of the Swiss pikemen and all how the various powers, France, the Habsburgs, Spain, etc., eventually copied all the system and even surpassed it at the beginning of the Italian Wars. But this is exactly the point that is controversial, and that is the idea in here that war, in spite of its destructiveness, actually develops the armed forces, right? This is pretty obvious. Maybe society goes downhill, and in fact part of the crisis here, including Black Death, whatever, today is also historiographically conceived, as we have seen many times, as mostly not as a consequence, not as a cause of the crisis, but probably as a consequence, in fact, of all these prolonged struggles that had occurred. Why? Because Europeans had got dramatically rich and had an enormous amount of resources to spend in warfare, as they did, right? And Contamine here starts listing actually the matter of the three countries we talk about today. And first of all, Italy, which is, as we've seen many times, one of the most overlooked countries in terms of military development in Western Europe in this context. So, what it tells us is that, as we know, central northern Italy was the theater during the second half of the 12th, especially after the first expedition of Frederick Barbarossa in 1154, the theater of repeated attempts from the side, in fact, of the Germanic emperors to re-establish their own dominion in the peninsula, right? And we know how it ended: the various Lombard leagues, eventually the defeat of the imperial attempt, which already speaks for. Consider that Germany by the mid 12th century had the greatest military capacity in Europe, right? France, as we've seen, was still small. There were still the English largely dominating most of the Plantagenets dominating most of France. As we know, and we will make a video also about this thing soon, the German emperors decided to channel. Frederick Barbarossa was a great centralizer. At the end of the day, he imported properly Western Frankish feudalism in Germany that up to that point had remained fairly. They knew the vassalatic beneficiary system, but there had not been yet a feudalization of the country. It was still also many ways underdeveloped. I mean, it was still largely covered in forests. It was actually rising pretty fast, right? But it was still, filling the gap with the rest of Western Europe in that sense. Frederick Barbarossa gives a boost, realizes that the Italian city-states are very rich, they are autonomous. Imperial authority had had all the rights to control that country, and he starts launching these expeditions to curb the cities that, namely the formal thing was curbing Milan, that was expanding over other city-states, to also intervene in papal affairs. And this starts as a series of bloody and destructive campaigns, right? Milan was at a certain point razed to the ground. The Milanese rebuilt it from scratch. That also tells you how the sheer amount of wealth from a quantitative point of view that the Italians had accumulated. It was something really bitter, right? That was the moment which the Germans couldn't make it to recreate properly, to unify East and West. I mean, Henry VI went as pretty damn close to conquer Constantinople at a point. There was all an enormous... the whole international policy was concerned. It was not a local struggle between the Germans and the Italians, right? It had probably also nothing to do with a national rivalry between it. Surely the fact that they were different, namely, they didn't even speak the same language, for example, that didn't help. But the problem there was not... I mean, there were plenty of Italians that were... the Italians always remained faithful to the imperial authorities. Nobody ever dreamt to say that the emperor didn't have a power. On the contrary, they just wanted to see recognized what they had fundamentally earned throughout their own work, their own trade, their own traffic, and all things, and that they wanted. Right, the Battle of Legnano in 1176 brought really to the failure of Barbarossa's project. The Lombard League obtained this great defeat. Frederick survived by chance. He was lost like for 3 days. That they didn't even know what the hell had happened. You can imagine the mess of these wars, what it was like, and it was rough, right? And the thing began. So once again with Frederick II, right? In the first half of the 13th century, Frederick resumed his grandfather's face in front of the Lombard cities, a different face than one he had, for example, in the Kingdom of Sicily or in Germany. This is interesting because the idea of Iron Fist was not abandoned. And, Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II were actually two very clever people. So the fact that they opted for sheer violence might even been a mistake, because actually the same Italians who fought for them said, but certain cruelties were gratuitous. They would have not helped politically to bring the cities under the imperial control. It was a failure in the end, right? It was an important failure, not just for what the Italian policy was concerned, but also for the fact that for other reasons that probably we'll discuss tomorrow. Speaking of the reign of Philip of Swabia and Otto of Brunswick were literally collapsing in Germany. That is to say, after the death of Henry VI, the central policy, the option of the practical possibility of creating a national monarchy in Germany, like in France or England, collapsed. Basically, the princes took over. Already Frederick II, he still insisted on naturally and obviously as it did on imperial authority and so on, but he basically transformed himself as just one of the other princes, was just aiming at expanding privately its power and using the public authority just to fundamentally buy the the census of the other private princes. So things in Germany began to change very rapidly. And as we will see now, also for Germany, that would trigger a set of conflicts and wars that would had an important impact also in the military developments of the same country. But the wars between the Staufer and the Lombard League saw some of the most important battles in European history at the time. And even later events, right? The settling of the Angevin dynasty in the Kingdom of Sicily after Frederick II and Manfred, also the difficulties of the same Angevins after the Sicilian Vespers in 1282, provoked new bitter conflicts that would have kept also being revived. And here we stop because it's the 14th century, we don't discuss about it, but eventually with both with the rise of Boniface VIII, but especially with the expedition of Henry the Seventh of Luxembourg in Italy, that opened to other 20 years of warfare, and also saw some of the most intense wars in Europe at the time, by far, just by sheer size of armies and concentration of wealth invested in it. So consider also that aside from this broader Italian, let's say, this broader foreign interventions in the Italian affairs, the same Italians kept fighting each other all the time. It's the famous struggle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, that of course is a bit more shaded than it sounds, but this coupled with the foreign ambitions, so as we've seen the German, the French, the Aragonese one, political fragmentation, commercial rivalries and competition, especially within this, what we can really call the center of the economical revival of Europe, because it was fundamentally Italy that had led all the not just the traffics, managed them, but accumulated the greatest amount of wealth out here, made of the peninsula during the 12th and 13th century one of the most, for sure, if not actually the most, in absolute terms, belligerent, warlike country in Europe, right? The numbers speak by themselves, right? And just to make a brutal synthesis, but there was plenty more of this, the battles of Legnano in 1176, that was the defeat of Frederick Barbarossa by the Milanese and the Brescians, right? Cortenuova in 1237. In there, the Italian infantry resisted for an entire day under the charges of the Imperial heavy cavalry, as we were saying before, had reached the apex in that point and eventually retreated in the night. Parma, Frederick in 1247, Frederick II was defeated, the Imperial camp sacked. But there are others. There's Fossalta, where Heinz, King of Sardinia, was captured by the Bolognese. But we find the Battle of Montaperti, that is in 1260, another major clash between the Florentines and the Siennese, with participation of German mercenaries. We're talking about thousands and thousands of men from every side. Benevent, 1266, right? The conquest of the Kingdom of Sicily by Charles of Anjou, with his Tuscan allies against Manfred, with his German and Sicilian and even Muslim troops. Tagliacozzo in 1268, famously, the victory and eventual defeat of Conradin of Swabia in the same battle, the hand of the reserve of Charles of Anjou, that included even in there the various allies, the Tuscans, from both sides. There were Italians from both sides, but there were even Spanish from the side of Conradin, and naturally the French, the Provençals from the side of Charles of Anjou. Roccavioni, 1275. There's the Piedmontese coalition that basically defeated the Angevin army and regained control on the region. But it's plenty of them. Think about Campaldino, 1289. These are battles of really big impact in the history, not just of Italy, sometimes of Europe, as you understand. Think about, Tagliacozzo could have been the entire European history would have changed, because if we would have not had the Angevins in the south of Italy, we would have had Conradin regaining Sicily and continuing the Stauffenberg dynasty. Think about just the relation with the paps in this sense, but we're talking specifically a lot of troops. We're talking about thousands of knights and tens of thousands of infantry. This is repeated over and over again across Italy in a way that, objectively, even just from a territorial point of view, in other countries you do not find with the same incidence. So I found this very interesting for a reason, that Contamine spoke at the beginning of, the idea that there was peace after all, and that this had brought prosperity. Here the Italians had been one of those peoples that had been the people that had accumulated greatest wealth and had never stopped making war, which is something you do not find in other regions. And we've made actually a video on the Italian communal armies and the tactics they developed. There would be more to come for that, because the actual, we will have to make I don't remember whether we made a video on the tactics and military organization, but I think it was military organization, then we'll make one specifically about tactics. But at this point, we have the first evidence of integrated system of combined arms in these armies, with specialized pikemen and crossbowmen in the thousands, something you don't find in any other European army at the time, on the wings, and heavy cavalry in the center. That is something you start finding just in the English armies from Halidon Hill, from 1332. That is to say that the Italians had developed certain military tactics that were regularly employed since 40 years before they would also be implemented by, as it is known by other countries. Right, and they were dramatically more advanced actually than the one of the communes that rebelled and won, like the Flemish at Courtrai. We made a video about this. They were just a mono-armed system of non-professionals, right? And just because they were just infantry, they came to a great notoriety. They rose to a great notoriety, but how obscured actually the military accomplishments of these other areas of Europe that were, just in terms of sheer structural cost and investment and magnitude of these armies, it's something incredible, right? And that's why I was saying that Italy is dramatically overlooked. And this is a bit of an exception to the picture, right? Because this may be the exception of the richest country that could afford to go on with warfare all along, but it's still the proof that this kind of pre-humanistic reality that is advanced under any point of view, cultural, economical, political, juridical, and so on, also produces a freaking damn advanced military system, making war continuously and still having money to go on. And this is not even the beginning, because the Renaissance is ahead to come, right? Passing to Germany. This is what Contamine also takes into consideration. Germany is also very overlooked, in my opinion. It's very different from Italy. At this point, Germany has, let's say, under the most different forms and causes, let's say, it's a political mosaic. Germany is much more fragmented than Italy. There are cities, say urban states, simple seigneuries, territorial principates, royal power. It's all intermediate. It's so messed up it never ends, right? And yet it's fascinating, because in all of this there is a kind of an institutional center that is still recognized, even though the center doesn't concretely exist, but it's shifted here and there according to the various lordships that rise to, princely powers that rise to royalty, right? But this is a land, Germany is a land of intense warfare, right? And it is historically so for a number of reasons. First of all, this is not one of the richest lands. But it's very populated. It's rising, actually. And therefore, people need, a bit like during the migration era, do not think that those dynamics weren't over. There are many young people that need to survive in a way, go fighting. Germany also doesn't have a frontier, right? Germany is opened, especially towards the east, to a world that has expanded into in the previous centuries, and that is highly unstable. It finds realities that still have to be defined, especially the Islamic monarchies and so on. Some are stronger. Think about Bohemia, that not surprisingly rises to the greatest power in the Holy Roman Empire by the, let's say, between the 1250s and the end of the 70s. But I mean, you find German communities pretty much everywhere, as you know, from Poland to Hungary, and think about the Baltic states, the Teutonic Order, that is a real state, by the way, right? Germany doesn't know anything like the Teutonic Order in the Baltic. Germany is much more fluid, privatistic. The Teutonic Order is an actual state. It's the precurrent, even a certain modern realities in terms of administration, concentration of power. There's constant warfare in a nutshell, right? And it doesn't end here. This is also, the Mongols arrive at the gates of Germany at this point. There is, after the collapse of the Hohenstaufen, there is continuous competition here. There is no rule. That's the problem. There is no real center. You see, Italy sounds similar because it was all this like 30 city-states fighting against each other. But at the end of the day, these are actual states, which means that it's not that there is someone who arrives and does whatever they want. Germany is a fluid reality. It's just the political geography of it tells you how intertwined, complex, compenetrated, let's say, intersected all these powers were. How it was something that really could shift from a point to another. I mean, think at this point the Habsburgs, the Wettins, the Luxembourgs. I mean, how they could, from a generation to another, shift the center of power from Austria to Bohemia, and how even these seigneuries were composed altogether. I mean, from a geographical point of view, they were all scattered. Think about the Habsburgs; they had their Alsatian, Swiss domains, and then they get Austrian, then they expand in Styria, Carinthia. They even reach overlordship, namely on Bohemia and even on Poland at some point. Right. What I find fascinating, even in German history, is how it's been overlooked. How there is this big problem of the collapse of the Hohenstaufen, and therefore people say, well, okay, so it was total. The fact that there was that central monarchy had failed means that there was no concrete power. That there were actually very concrete powers, right? The Habsburgs might have had things gone differently. If Albert hadn't been assassinated, or there had been other victories on the field, might have actually consolidated one of the greatest powers in the Middle Ages that it had de facto reached by the end of the 13th century, after Markfeld and the defeat of the Bohemians. But let's say that even in here there is a contraction. That is what we see from the next century. So things, even in Germany, energies were being spent, and as hell they were spent. And what does a land that is now fully feudalized and in continuous warfare achieve, with a military class that had sedimented like the one of the ministeriales that were fundamentally knights at this point, that had de facto also lost their servile status? It's, of course, cavalry. Germany at this point starts exporting a freaking hell of cavalry that has reached and perhaps even surpassed the French one. And I'm not kidding. This is something that I'm actually very interested in, because I dedicated myself to these topics particularly, especially studying these three countries altogether, and also Flanders and England in part, because you realize that French cavalry at that point was not perhaps as warlike as it had been before. Let's leave aside that during the to me it was always of the first order. I'm not actually convinced that German cavalry was better than the French one in terms, for example, of collective training. The French were really a step ahead in that sense. But in terms of moral forces, the Germans display something that went past even that gap in terms of collective quality, and just for sheer what you find even in the local chronicles called still as furor, right? The Italians, for example, that hire, full of money, they start hiring all of these fundamentally decayed German ministerialists that search for fortune in south of the Alps, speak of the German furor of the classical sources, and these guys collect an astonishing series of victories on the field that is not to be found. I mean, the Italians do not achieve it. The French do not achieve it. These guys freaking beat each other like hell, and they do things that others do not risk. So for that reason, I presume that French pacification we'll talk about before we'll actually conclude the video with had actually decreased simply demotivating factors for going out there and die, right? Which an average German knight of the second half of the 13th century, the first half of the 14th, still said had. Because Germany didn't have the structures of the French kingdom that could keep everybody at bay, mobilizing them just when they wanted. No, it was like, I can say far west, but it was still an extremely fluid situation. And in this extremely fluid situation, you find as hell a great deal of professionalism involved. Right? I mean, Ottokar II of Bohemia at Markfeld fights alongside not the Bohemian nobility that he even thought they were pretty much unreliable, also because, you know, he had objectively ousted them, but with the Saxon mercenaries, right? And they fight to the death, including himself, right? With that, and the reason there is such a even a Germanization. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, we could say that the Mediterranean, as we've seen also with the Latin Empire, the Crusades has become French military culture. Central Europe is deeply Germanized. Look at the Polish military vocabulary. It's basically all Slavicized German names, right? There is a feudalism there that is exported during the push towards the east that brings with itself also specific military techniques, ethos, symbology. Germany was a land that exported in that sense, and that at the beginning of the 13th century, in my opinion, had altogether was more robust in terms of military quality, in spite of the weakness of these principalities compared to national monarchies of France and England. But it had, in terms of the quality of the troops, something that other countries didn't have. And we're talking basically exclusively about cavalry, right? There are certain victories. There is a certain performance of German infantries here and there. I mean, the Swiss were Germans at the end of the day themselves, but those are a bit peripheral. I mean, it's just like the Flemish a little bit. And I mean, they're completely different, of course, but you can always find the angry peasant communities that are fighting for their own freedom. But altogether, Germany is heavily feudalized, right? The city-states are not like in Italy that they have a countryside. They even conquer other cities. Those are, the city stops to the walls, and outside there is the great prince. Like, it can be a bishop, great ecclesiastical lords in Germany, as you know, or the secular ones as well. So Germany, in this sense, is a very warlike country. There is a multitude of conflicts, right? That only in part the so-called Landfriede could interrupt, or sometimes even to limitate. Actually, the rise of the Swiss against the Habsburgs at this time, ironically, it had basically nothing to do with the eventual national construction of Swiss identity. It was just a Landfriede. These guys didn't want to pay taxes to the Habsburgs. They didn't want the power to consolidate. They had gotten rich, ironically, under the Swabian times, where Frederick II had given them rights to cross the Alps in certain places to become rich with money. They fought for their freedom. They exploited the terrain, that were very clever. At this point, the Swiss do not win because they have much of a strong or stronger infantry than other European ones, like they would become in the mid-15th century. They're clever, they're smart, they make ambushes, they win, they catch the moment, right? And they're very clever, we're also very lucky, but they definitely earn their their freedom, but it becomes also as something very bloody between themselves, right? The confederacy expands over time, and it's a complex thing, but it begins with this thing of the Landfried that is basically the pacification of the land, that was this provision issued usually by the imperial authority to literally put an end to the wars of the princes. Well, at this point, this tells you how much imperial authority had fallen, but it just local communities issue land freed. So consider that the same Germanic emperors had to cope with multiple times to general revolts. So that tells you also how strong and confident these princes were to challenge authority in there. Consider that when the Hohenstaufen were fighting against the Lombards, or trying to regain their Sicilian legacy and whatever, these German princes, of course, rode backwards, right? They didn't want that. They didn't like that. They didn't like to pay for the expeditions. The Stauffer armies were basically all about ecclesiastical contingents. The secular princes basically didn't participate, right? Because the bishops had more interests, were more framed, especially the big ones of the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. Not always, but they were more committed institutionally to the idea of the empire, also because it was used for them to expand in turn at the damage of the secular powers, and they weren't as hereditary as the secular ones, so the emperors looked at them more favorably, right? But also the foundation of the Freie Reichsstädte were functional to the idea of checking private power at the local level from the side of the German kings. So here Contamine says, starting from the death of Frederick II, there is the opening of the Great Interrangem in Germany that opens the path to the military anarchy. Yes, and we have seen that, albeit chaos did exist, were however specific, dynamics and also dynasties that at the end of the day held some order, right? It's not that when Frederick II died everything collapsed. No, right? The Hohenstaufen rule actually continued after him, and it wasn't at all a sudden break. So this is an example how even an authoritative scholar can express. I'm reading this stuff also to make you understand how sometimes you can't get tricked in perspective just by the semantics of how things are written. Right, we'll talk about the Interregnum. Actually, one of you asked me about it. We will do it. Yes, we'll talk about the German Interregnum at this point. It's one of my favorite topics. Actually, I studied it when I wrote the master thesis. And I'm a great fan of Rudolf of Habsburg, by the way. So, but not only of him, but of the period specifically. Because this was an age change. It is true, yes. With the death of Frederick II, a big deal of things changed in European history, but at the same time, it wasn't so rapid. Rudolf of Habsburg's life, in a way, documents what it means to have been born, to being young at the time of Frederick II, to die in the 90s of the 13th century, as king of the Romans, as he never became actually emperor, but in a completely different, like in the Germany of princes. Princely Germany. We even made a video about princely Germany. We'll keep talking about that. And in the Holy Roman, finishing the thing with Italy and Germany specifically, this world, the Holy Roman Empire, here is deeply intertwined. And I think altogether is very, but very overlooked in itself, because it's unavoidable. It's not our fault, but I mean, the fact is that it's obvious that English or French historiography have been more important and have focused more on certain periods and certain eras and certain passages. I think for today's Europe it's dramatically important to reevaluate the Holy Roman Empire altogether, Germany, Italy, and naturally the deep intersections with France at the same time. Because that's where literally most of the most important things that would become evident in Europe also in the following centuries took place, right? And I don't want to exclude Spain or England or on any other country in here, but the question is that these were really intertwined. It was really they really make a trio that must be carefully examined, re-examined, and also in perspective. Just to make an example, as we were saying before, lots of German mercenaries start making their fortune in Italy, right? And they're actually called by the Italians for that, and paid and searched specifically, and hired in large numbers, in the thousands, all over the peninsula. And by, as we've seen, a military system that was already dramatically advanced, so that, for example, heavy German cavalry was placed very functionally together with that specialized professional Italian infantry to create a combined arms system that, as we were saying before, it was unknown in Europe up to the achievements of the English. And speaking of the French in that regard, we have to acknowledge that there was a weakening of French grip on Italy itself. Were important expeditions, after all, of German kings, eventually emperors, in Italy at this time: Henry VII, Ludwig the Bavarian, John of Bohemia with his son Charles, the future Charles IV. Well, in here you see actually the decrease of imperial power all along. That goes together with the contraction of economy here. It was essentially the Italians who financed these expeditions for bringing these sovereigns to put an order that they wanted to create, especially within the Guelph-Ghibelline struggle. It was, in that sense, like a French-German struggle, but still, at this point, managed by the same incipient Italian regional states that were literally those ones, as I said, that paid for the whole thing on purpose, and also buying titles, legitimization within the same Holy Roman Empire with titles and so on. France here doesn't set foot in it. First of all, they're busy with the Flemish, where they get the important defeat of Courtrai, and surely they managed to achieve some success eventually. But even the same Angevin kingdom at this point in Italy that had controlled the various cities, at least in terms of military protection and so on, at this point contracts dramatically. They lose basically any power in the north. And so this shift of balance doesn't speak actually favorably for French military culture, right? And eventually, as we know, the 100 Years' War starts, where also the French collect an astonishing series of defeats. Albeit, I'm always of the advice that we have been too harsh with the French during 100 Years' War. I think but it's not I'm not just of the advice. I mean, I know that we literally do not know anything concretely about the necessity of French cavalry to be defeated by the English all the time. Surely it's an astonishing success, but England at that point is rewarded by the fact of that political unity that allows Edward I, II, and III finally to create this exceptional military system that will achieve in terms of, as we often said, in terms of, if you look at the numbers, in conditions of symmetry, in terms of material culture and so on, achieved the greatest results in the history, in the annals of military history. Like, there is no other country, people, army, whatever, that achieved repeatedly. This is pure mathematics. This has nothing to do with personal opinions. The same amount of results the English achieved during the 100 Years' War. You may like it, not like it, I don't give a damn. It's like that, and it cannot be denied. The question here is why it happened, and whether the French were actually incapable of making a change, which might appear so, but at the same time I think they were actually doing well, and that we have definitely been a bit too harsh towards them. So with the broader contraction of the 13th and 14th at the end of the 13th and 14th century, we also start lacking the capacity of seeing the comparison between these countries, because France gets engulfed in the 100 Years' War, the Germans basically, with Ludwig the Bavarian, say even that they can't be crowned emperors without going to Italy, making all the Raumfahrt and the papal crowning. The Italians get a bit isolated at that point, and this is all very relative. On the contrary, actually, international relations actually increased, especially between Italy and Germany, especially when the Rhone Valley trade highway was blocked by Genoa. Also opened the Atlantic route with England, and Venice boosted the Alpine traffics with Bavaria. France does suffer this, but at the same time, the reason why I say that specifically at the turn of the 13th century, the beginning of the 14th century, French cavalry doesn't obtain clamorous victories may be explained by what Contamine points out in here, right? Because indeed, France and England were more tranquil than Italy and Germany, right? Speaking of Edward III, Edward III's tactics, let's call it in this way, but those had been pioneered since the Scottish Wars started by Edward I. So the English actually had a very good school that brought them to implement the numbers of longbowmen, to actually start even dismounting their men-at-arms. That's something that was produced in Britain, and it was a British thing, right, between the English and the Scots. We also talked about it recently, and we made a video on 13th century English infantry that explains a bit that, and all the prejudices that we have about the technologistic things, about the longbow and so on, but that is also, nobody denies it, the single most effective thing, as we were saying before. But speaking of France, right, here Contamine leaves the gap open, chronologically speaking, because he points out, first of all, the duel. He says, they were more tranquil, but there was still this war between the Great War between the Capetians and the Plantagenets, culminated in 1214 with the victories carried out by Philip Augustus at La Roche-Aumont. That was the siege where, how the thing had happened. John I of England had split forces to make pincer movement on the Ile-de-France, and that was the first French victory actually with the son of Philip, and then eventually at Bouvines against the Anglo-Germans with Philip himself. But we're talking of the very beginning of the 13th century, right? When he makes the list of the Italian battles, they are also from the 12th, but there is an evident increase towards the second half of the 13th century, and even more than what he actually lists here. He also lists here for France the Albigensian Crusade and the consequences that deeply perturbed Occitania for a generation, when eventually Louis IX was able to collect the Tolosan inheritance, and therefore to include fundamentally what became southern France at that point in the French domains, in the royal domains. And even here we are at the beginning of the 13th century. What does Contamine says here? That at the end of our period, so technically it would be towards the 1300, right, there is the resuming of the French-English conflict. Yes, in part, there is the conquest of Wales from Edward I, right? And his campaigns against Scotland that we remember before, the hostility of Philip the Fourth against the Flemish, Courtrai, as we remember before, in all the various battles afterwards. Interestingly enough, the French at that point used Italian infantry to fight against the Flemish infantry, and seemingly the Flemish were very impressed, especially with the Italian pikemen, which you never seen. This tells you how we may have to look very carefully about certain relations of strength. But And then Contamine ends with the fact, that eventually the French involvement in Flanders would trigger the Dynastic Wars and Dynastic National Wars of the end of the Middle Ages. We're talking chiefly about the 100 Years' War. That was definitely a big thing starting from the 30s of the 14th century. But what it's pointing out here is pretty vaguely the fact that indeed in the majority of this time, France, in all its landmass, didn't have, in the full of the 13th century, even towards the end, not this huge war going on, compared to Italy and Germany, where people were beating each other from sunset to dawn, all the time, throughout all the century, right? France, yes, they invaded Aragon, and they were defeated. It was the same Philip IV that got himself out of that, and he bet on Flanders, and they went there, and essentially they, France won, but it was kind of a draw, right? And also the English would be involved later, and that's where also what the 100 Years' War in part was, also, at least in part, triggered by. What I'm saying here is that, to me, there is an evident imbalance between the belligerency of the Holy Roman Empire to one France. Right? The fact that the great victories achieved by the French at the beginning of the 13th century, where they literally had a hell of a decades of warfare against the Plantagenets over time. They weren't even, yes, as at the beginning, Contamine said, they weren't even dramatically intense in terms of frequency, but it still had their substance. They were very harsh battles. Even think about the development of siege capabilities. Think about Chateau Gaillard on the Seine, and the clash with Richard Lionheart. I mean, those were important wars, right? There was even the attempt of French landing in England at that point. There were interesting things from the French side. That was a warlike monarchy, where also kings were still directly involved into the command, into fighting, to the they were always in command technically, but still more directly into the strictly combat side of the story. After that, France, as we know, rockets to the stars, but it rockets to the stars in terms of politics, of administration, right? Decentralized. The monarchy also starts investing on the bourgeois for creating a skilled bureaucratic milieu for the court, for the local administration, of also the newly acquired provinces. Yes, but how much war did they concretely make? Probably a lot, right? Still, for what we think war could be at the time, but I think never as much, no so intensely at a local level, and especially in France itself, as much as the Italians and the Germans did. Also, the Crusades in the East were failures. Like Louis IX invades Egypt. It was a promising thing, but thing ended pretty bad. Right, he had to retreat in time, not to be captured. The same nobility said, "Get out of here, because otherwise you'll be captured by the Saracens." In Tunisia, the whole thing failed. Just think even about the fact of spending a freaking lot of money, like for an expedition like that, and not accomplishing anything, and all the intrinsic fragility of monarchies of any kind, and that was France, right? But still, the assets were big. It's important. It was an important economical crisis. The French need money, so what they start doing is they slaughter the Templars at the end of the, under Philip IV. They slaughter the Templars. They confiscate wealth from the Italians, from the Jews. They start quarreling with the papacy because of Caesar papism. In fact, that the French wanted to extend the king wanted to extend direct control in the French church. So there is an evident struggle. They wanted to invade Flanders. Why? Because they needed the money of those city-states, who were fatly rich. So there is a struggle, and these struggles largely fail at the end of the day. And altogether, this is the picture of something that, you see, what France had achieved in terms of statal construction was immense. But in terms of the adjustments of the military standards to it, well, was difficult to achieve something, right? And this is not to say that French cavalry was not good. French armies were not good. But they may have not been so morally involved, right, in terms of moral forces, as much as the ferocious competition that the Italians and the Germans were having within their respective lands and even against each other, especially at the beginning of the period. So, in my opinion, this explains. So, when you read the books of this, let's say, disclosure in books about medieval warfare, you rarely hear about what happened in Germany or Italy, right? You get the small part about Germany. There is basically nothing. There is here and there some battle, maybe the German campaigns in Italy. Italy gets its own paragraph, first of all, at the beginning, like in the 12th century, with the Italian Communal armies, and it passes immediately to the beginning of the Signories and the beginning of the Condottieri, right? All in between, like how the passage happened, what was dealt with in the middle, nothing. The thing is polarized by either the Capetian Plantagenet struggle, the Crusades, because mostly also the French and the English participated too there, and then everything is all about, again, the 100 Years' War, and then about the War of the Roses. This is mostly what, and I get it, right? It's normal that the Anglosphere dominates the world in terms of influence, etc. But more recent publications that are exceptionally also coming from the Anglo-Saxon world that I cannot stop to take, because most of what I learned to about this stuff is all thanks to the interest of the Anglosphere, let's call it this way. I have no better way of saying it, but naturally have, especially in the previous few decades ago, have sometimes concentrated the attention on a certain part, which is fine, which is great, right? And because nobody would have even talked about countries like Spain or Italy or Germany in the first place, hadn't they mentioned there to become success in terms of successful publications and so on, right? But the point here is that I presume, and it's something that I hope I explained well enough in my PhD thesis now that I'm fixing, given that I've been given other 3 months because of coronavirus and so on. I had finished, as you know, but the point there is pretty heavily an accusation to the fact that we have, in part, misaddressed most issues concerning medieval warfare, in my opinion. I know it sounds an arrogant statement, but it's something that here and there pops out, and nobody ever put it together yet, historiographically speaking. And I pointed out, in these videos, because without this omnicomprehensive realization, this comparative analysis, we can rarely get the value of the individual pieces here and there, right? That's why we talk about all this stuff together. That's why we are concerned specifically in talking about all the various types of tactics, of equipments, of military organizations, of wars, of broader political and social aspects on Schwerpunkt, because that's what really matters. Because if you stop just to one thing, you go nowhere. There's no pride in saying, I come from this country, so I learned the history of my country. You will never know the history of your country like that. It's meaningless, because you have literally no idea what the rest was like. And this is the damage of hyper-specialization in the academies as well. There is no comprehensive view. There is no synthesis. Our brain is meant to have this dramatic synthesis capability. And reasoning like that means to refuse, that is, to go completely backwards compared to what actually these great historians of the past, up to a few generations ago, actually had. That is, they were literally human encyclopedias. That unfortunately, for political reasons, they didn't concentrate too much on warfare, because after World War II, once again, just the Anglosphere did, because they were the winners. Well, other countries were like, no, we were the fascists, so it's bad to study warfare, the communists take over the the educational systems. This happened in the United States a little bit too, but not in the same ways, and especially from a different background that surely cannot be equated to the European one. Actually, Americans are very interested, but I mean very interested in, and they have a great hunger of medieval history because they love it. First of all, they recognize it's very important, which is a great thing just for a country of that importance to realize such things. Not being the same kind. I mean, it's not because at least traditionally the United States are, were essentially what's the language of the United States, right? Still, it's obviously European derived, but the question is, how much could countries can speak to each other, and I see in the West people are from both sides. As far as also the Europeans, I personally would like to know so much more about American history, and therefore we have this huge interests in common. We have always had them. We're so much the same thing at so many levels. We need to strengthen this bond. We don't need to go apart. We don't need to be out there on our own. And this is the risk we're suffering, because just like at the end of this great medieval civilization, contraction, crisis brought to the partial isolation, to the carving of certain more, distinct realities that didn't have much of, not necessarily the dialogue they had before, that action increased, but we the tendency to me seems like that we feel like crisis equates to let's think just about on our own. No, it can't be like that. We have to think all together, because that's our strength. That's what we can do together, right? And this is no Middle Ages. We know the importance of so many things, and we know how to overcome this potentially, right? And we can do it. So the sooner we learn how to rethink history comprehensively, and not fixating just on a detail or on a single perspective or single topic, we can understand the whole thing better than we have done in the past. As we were saying before, having tons of books that have analyzed capillarly every aspect of Middle Ages still doesn't mean to have books that are capable of making a synthesis of it. You say, well, that's impossible because we know too much. Yes, but I can tell you, for example, that by a certain standard, you can't always do it, by a certain degree. But the problem is that, look at military history. Certain things, I realize, we have not studied them. Like, if you search for certain specific topics about medieval warfare, someone wrote about them, but still hasn't expanded on them. And at deep levels, right? So, and at large levels. Sometimes not so much deep levels, in the sense that certain ideas are still very approximated. Right, this thing I said, especially about Italy or Germany, well, in my opinion, and I know a little bit that you, historiographically, what the two countries are about, they still need to be seen again. That they still need to be conceived, rethought, rediscussed, because I think we have missed a huge part of medieval warfare. In this moment, especially, that is so particular. It's the first moment we start having enough sources. It's paradoxical because it's the end. We can't see better. The end of that huge medieval civilization eventually shrunk in the 14th century, right? So it's so crucial for understanding the before and the after, and this is central in medieval history. And we need to really reread it very, very carefully, right? But I hope, when I make these videos, I never fully understand whether I'm clear. When I talk, it's just like, aside from it can be boring to listen to me for such a long time. But I mean, the fact that whether I am capable of delivering the content, the fact, right? If I explain myself clearly. Because I really care about being understood. Maybe not fully, but at least the substance, the essence of it, right? I want it to be clear, because I think it's really important. I wouldn't make these videos anyway, right? Otherwise, I mean, Alright, so for now, we stop here. We will readdress the whole thing multiple times. Never fear that Schwerpunkt talks about one thing and never talks about it anymore, right? We always come back on these topics, but they're so big that even if I spoke my entire life about it, they would never be fully covered, right? So it never ends. I just hope for now that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.